Jesus had the ability to simultaneously comfort the disturbed and then disturb the comfortable. And Luke chapter 14 is a really great example of this double-edged influence that Jesus had. Now, our text begins in verse 25, but I want you just to turn over and look at the beginning section of that chapter 14, verses 1 to 24. It all begins with him getting invited to this dinner party at the beginning of the chapter. And what we see Jesus doing is he's being deliberately disruptive at this dinner party. He's not just sitting back and enjoying himself. He's teaching in a very uncomfortable way. So at this dinner party, if you look at verses 1 to 6, you'll notice it's on the Sabbath. And Jesus openly, deliberately heals a person on the Sabbath in front of everybody, knowing that it would ruffle feathers. And then look at verses 7 to 11. He turns to all the guests at the party, and he rebukes them for their pride. And then, verses 12 to 14, he tells the host who invited him that he's actually invited the wrong kind of people to the party. And then, without hesitation, he refers to eating the bread of the kingdom of God in verse 15 as my banquet. Verse 25. You won't find any of this in How to Win Friends and Influence People. This is not Jesus, the winsome, agreeable everyman. This is Jesus, the disruptor. And you've got to love him for it. So when we pick our text up in verse 25, you'll see that the scene changes, but the disruption continues. There are great crowds following him in verse 25, but Jesus seems intent on thinning them out by going on and on about who cannot be my disciple. Verse 26, verse 27, verse 33, who cannot be my disciple. It's like he's determined to upset not only his critics, verses 1 to 24, but also his potential followers, verses 25 to 35. Now, of course, we know, Jesus isn't trying to alienate people. He wants us to follow him. But the point of this lesson is that he wants us to follow him on his terms, not ours. There might be a few would-be disciples here today. And if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, here are 3 things that you need to know about him before following him. And I think these are 3 things that current disciples of Jesus need to hear again. So 3 things. The first is the claim that we've got to hear, verses 25 and 26. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So that language is very stark, isn't it? It's very shocking. To be his disciple requires hating your family, hating your own life. What is this? And at this point in the sermon, I'm supposed to say that Jesus doesn't literally mean hate, but this is a Semitic idiom meaning to love less. And then I'm supposed to direct you to a similar passage in Matthew to explain the hyperbole, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Matthew 10, 37 and 38, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And so you do that, and then you give all the caveats, you give all the asterisks, and it kind of robs the shock value of Jesus' claim. It kind of dulls the edge of that knife so that it no longer cuts us like it should. So let's back up, understanding all the caveats, and let's ask ourselves, who has a right to speak this way? Jesus is claiming that he must have the sole and supreme place of affection in our hearts, in our lives. Now, what other scripture demands such unconditional devotion? Are not the words of Jesus in Luke 14:26 just the first commandment wrapped in different packaging? The first commandment that says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Jesus is calling for the same loyalty that Yahweh required of his people Israel at Sinai. So to be Jesus' disciple demands that same level of devotion. We need to hear that claim. I think many people come to Christ and they come to a soft, mushy Jesus. He is not a soft Messiah. Only God can make such a claim. The massive assumption underlying Jesus' words in verse 26 is his deity. No one but God has a right to demand such love. Again, that's a claim that everyone has to hear. When Yahweh said, "You shall have no other gods before me," he didn't want to be Israel's favorite God, one among many. He wanted to be Israel's only God. And how does this relate to our family? Why does he bring family into this? Well, we love our family, don't we? And Jesus loved his family. And he shows that throughout the Gospels, the kind of care that he has for his family. But we may deify our family, those relationships, or even our own desires in our own lives. Not by necessarily bowing down to them and offering animal sacrifices to them, but by compromising what we know to be true to appease those people. By trading our convictions about Jesus to preserve their comfort, to spare their feelings, and by maintaining those relationships at the expense of our loyalty to Christ, we're guilty of committing idolatry. Jesus is saying he's not going to accept divided loyalties. That's a claim that we've got to hear. Now, the second thing is he talks about a calculation that we have to make, verses 27 to 33. First of all, he talks about what we carry. It says, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now here he's illustrating what hating even one's own life in verse 26 involves, carrying our own cross. But carrying your cross is not a metaphor for inconvenience or enduring disappointments. You know, sometimes we use that phrase in that way, like, well, everyone's got their cross to bear, and it's because we've got allergies in the fall or something like that. That's not at all what Jesus means, and no one would even think that in the first century. In the first century, they knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. He's talking about a symbol for death, particularly death by Roman crucifixion. It was a disgusting, shameful way, painful way, humiliating way to die. Jesus wanted his disciples in the first century to be aware that the Roman government may execute you in the most cruel, shameful way for following him. And he wants them to be prepared for that. The manner of execution may differ for us, but is the principle not the same? This is the calculation that we need to make today, and we need to make it every day. Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says the same kind of thing. He says, "But you must pick up your cross daily and follow me." Now, this is an extreme example, isn't it? But it's an extreme example on purpose. Because if we're willing to sacrifice our very lives for him, then any other sacrifice that we are called to make in life is lesser by degree. So this is where he starts. He argues from the greater to the lesser. Talks about what we carry. And then he talks about what we count, verse 28 to 32. He says, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he's able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So you see what he's getting at here. He's talking about what we have to count, the calculation we have to make. He gives these two parables to drive the point home. Potential construction project, possible armed conflict. And both cases call for cautious consideration. Lest, on the case of the builder, your half-built tower becomes the laughingstock of the community. I remember whenever, I don't know if Rachel, you remember this, but whenever we go home to Ohio, we go past this on the highway on the interstate through Pennsylvania. There's a great big church building, and then you could see where they started to build like a Noah's Ark. And it kind of makes you laugh because, number one, it's kind of short and stubby. It's like the proportions are all off, but it's just like steel girder beams, and clearly they ran out of money. It's funny, but it's a failure, isn't it? And the other one, of course, is more serious. You end up suing for peace on the battlefield, like the king in verse 31 and 32. But Jesus' point here is not some people have the resources to be disciples and other people don't. His point is that you need to make some realistic, sober calculations before you decide to follow him. Now, that's not a pleasant thing to consider. It's a bit like going to a funeral home and like planning for your own funeral or writing out your will or something like that. No one likes to contemplate their own death, pick out their grave plot. That's not fun. Divvy up their assets to their children. It's not one's favorite pastime, but it is necessary, isn't it? It is wise to face it yourself and relieve your family of sorting through the mess after you die so they can grieve properly. That's the kind of thing he's talking about here in regards to discipleship. You need to give this some thought about what we carry, what we count, and then what we surrender. Verse 33, so therefore any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. So therefore, so Jesus is kind of summing things up for us. And what do we have to renounce to be his disciple? What does he say? All that you have, you've got to renounce it. Every relationship, every possession, every ambition, you have to renounce it all. And renounce is just a fancy way of saying say goodbye, farewell. That's how it's used in other places. Someone so-and-so said farewell to someone else. We're saying goodbye to it. Now, certainly, there are many things that we just have to walk away from in order to follow Jesus, right? We need a clean break with any kind of sinful activity or habit that we have. We need to bid farewell to those things. But here he's emphasizing a kind of mental renunciation of all things, where we no longer see all that we have as belonging to us, but as belonging to him. So the difference is between stewardship and ownership. So to follow Jesus, you need to begin to see your life in terms of stewardship rather than ownership. And when you begin to see your life that way, it really changes the way that you use the things that have been given to you, doesn't it? The things that have been entrusted to you, your body, your choices, your life, your relationships, the kind of words that you use, the kind of clothes that you wear, the kind of places that you go, the kind of things that you watch. All of that suddenly matters now. Well, maybe it didn't matter before because you could say, it's my life. Well, it's not your life if you're a disciple of Jesus. It's his. There's this heightened sense of responsibility. It's not a paralyzing anxiety, but it is a sober awareness that your life is sacred and it's precious to God and it counts. Therefore, it should be used for his purposes. It reminds me of what Paul says to the Corinthians, who were using their bodies to do immoral things. And Paul has to remind them that their body is a temple for the Holy Spirit within them, whom you have from God. He says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. We're stewards. We're not owners. I know I've talked about Uncle Jerry's Mustang before, but here it is again in all of its glory in some museum or something in Cleveland. Bought it new in 1969. It's a special Mustang. It's not your run-of-the-mill Mustang. It was a Trans Am homologation special. They only build a certain amount of these things, and basically it's just so Ford can go racing and beat the tar out of everyone else. So he buys this anew, and he restores it and all that, and it's just pristine. I mean, it was taken down to like every nut and bolt, and every detail of this thing was gone through. So when Rachel and I were living in Indiana, we lived pretty close to the Capitol, and Uncle Jerry comes, and there's this Mustang show at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and so he's going to take me to it. We're going to drive down and drive his car down, and we're walking out to the car and looking at this thing. Wow, what a piece of history, I mean, cars are so different now. And he just throws me the keys. He says, "You're driving." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm not going to drive your car." He says, "Yes, you are. Come on, hop in." And I don't know if you guys have ever driven a car without power steering or power brakes or ABS. It's a different experience. It's very, very different. And I can tell you, I did not drive it the way I drive my car. It wasn't mine. It was Jerry's car, and it was very precious. And so I didn't want to be guilty of putting his classic in a ditch. When we become disciples of Christ, we're handing the deed, we're handing the title of our life over to Jesus. It no longer belongs to us. We're renouncing all that we have to him. Now, he keeps the title, but what he does is he gives us back the keys. And he tells us to follow him. And be careful how you follow him. Everything we do with our life needs to be rethought under that principle of stewardship rather than ownership. And finally, we come to verses 34 and 35, and he talks about the caution that we must show. He says, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Now, he's not talking about salt, is he? I mean, he's talking about salt without talking about salt, right? Now, unfortunately, the ESV scrubs away the therefore that's supposed to be there in verse 34. There is a therefore, there are so or because or something to connect it back to what he said. So this is all kind of summing up what he's talking about. He's comparing would-be disciples with salt, isn't he? Now, I know we quarry for salt. I don't even know how this works, but we get salt differently than they got salt. In Syria, Palestine, the main method they got salt was they would get it from these marshes that had a high salt content, or these salty lakes in the interior, like the Dead Sea. And you'd go in the water, and you'd pull up this salt, and you'd pile it all up on the shore. And that meant when it was piled up, it would come in contact sometimes with soil, earth, and the sun would bake it, and there'd be rain sometimes and moisture. And sometimes if there was enough of these contaminants that got in the soil, the sodium chloride would actually leach out, and it would render the salt tasteless and useless. You couldn't do anything with it. And so it still looked like salt, but it had lost all of its beneficial qualities. It lost its saltiness, Jesus says here. So what is he saying? Well, let's say that you jumped on the Jesus bandwagon without counting the cost. You didn't do what he said to do. You got really excited to follow him because you hear this guy, you're attracted to his message, you see the kind of things that he's doing, you see his heart, and you're just so stirred up emotionally that you just jump in. You want all those blessings that only he could give, but you didn't take into account what discipleship is really going to demand of you. And then, later on down the road, when the cost of following him hits home, and there's some conflict, some crisis arises that really tests your faith and your devotion in him, all that initial positive emotion, all of that enthusiasm that you used to have, it starts to fade away. Now, what is Jesus saying about such a person here? How shall its saltiness be restored? And that's, of course, rhetorical. It can't be. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Rachel was listening to a podcast. She just told me about it last night. I forget all the details about it, but interviewee was apparently some like monk. He'd trained in some kind of monastery, lived this kind of ascetic life, and then he left that. He learned all sorts of wisdom, and he became some mogul who makes, I don't know, gobs and gobs of money, and now he's got this podcast, and he's got all these real positive things to say, you know, and he's talking about truth. And he's got these different things, these different kind of taglines about truth and how truth, is important, and how, when you speak, you need to make sure you're always speaking the truth. And you're like, amen, that's great. And you got to make sure that when you're speaking the truth, that it aligns with, eternal principles. And you're thinking, well, okay, I'm not really sure what he means by that, but yeah, okay. Then he says that the truth that you speak should never disturb other people's minds. And that loses me. There are times we need to be disturbed. There are times that our lives need to be disrupted. Your life is not about maintaining pleasant circumstances and feeling good all the time. There are some times we need to be faced with some hard realities, especially when thinking about committing to Jesus. So before you get baptized, hear the claim that Jesus makes. He commands our total devotion, a loyalty that is going to supersede everything else. Count the cost that Jesus demands. He bids us to surrender all we have to him and follow him wherever he leads. And exercise the caution that he's urging, not because discipleship isn't worth it, but because it's far too serious a thing to take lightly. Jesus would rather have 10 disciples who are truly committed to him than have 100 people who profess their faith but don't live it out. Now, I realize that isn't the most, evangelistic, positive kind of thing, but hey, it reminds me of what Joshua says at the end of Joshua 24. Do you remember this? Joshua, at the end of his life, he's at Shechem, and he's addressing the people before he dies, and he tells them, you guys need to fear the Lord, and you need to serve him with sincerity and faithfulness. You need to put away your idols. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people immediately respond very, very positively by committing themselves to the Lord. But then Joshua tells them, you're not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. You're thinking, Joshua, why are you such a downer? These people just said they're going to follow the Lord. Shouldn't you be happy? And it's as if Joshua is saying, hey, guys, do you realize what it means to serve a holy and jealous God who demands your total loyalty? Have you really thought about your own tendencies toward infidelity and what the consequences of that would be like? It's not that Joshua is trying to turn these people away from the Lord. No, far from it. He wants to deepen their commitment. He wants them to think it through more thoroughly. And that's the same kind of thing Jesus is doing here. He doesn't tell us all this heavy stuff about discipleship to scare us away, but to get us thinking so that we can follow him correctly. No one can say Jesus is guilty of false advertising. He doesn't want fair weather fans. He wants faithful disciples. And if you're not willing to put your life on the line and carry your cross and do everything that entails, then you cannot be Christ's disciple. But realize that in choosing to preserve your life the way it is, if you're going to walk away from this, if you're going to say no thanks, you will absolutely lose everything in the end. You'll have nothing. But when you choose to renounce your life and surrender all to Jesus, you have everything of eternal value to gain. There might be someone this morning who's on the fence, and if you've been persuaded by the words of Jesus here, then he invites you to come to him on his terms and devote yourself to him. If you need the prayers of this congregation, now's the time to let us know as we stand up and we sing together.